Hey, it's Mike Kim here. Welcome to this episode of the show. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for tuning in. Today's a special episode because I am celebrating 10 years of this podcast. That's right. I started my podcasting journey in February of 2014, if you can believe that. I can't. It's pretty astounding to me. And I wanted to share a couple of things that I've learned along the way. This is just really just from the heart. Podcasting is been a huge part of my business, but more than that, my life. It's funny because I never thought of myself as a podcaster. I just felt like podcasting was something I happened to do as part of what I do for my business. I was a consultant who happened to podcast, if you will, not a podcaster who consulted and did other things. And I think when I started out, there was a little bit of an aversion to me personally to describe myself as a podcaster because I didn't really understand the medium. I listened to podcasts back then, uh, and a lot's happened, since those years. Podcasting has now become very mainstream, very popular, and it shows no signs of slowing down. But when I started out, not many people I knew listened to podcasts, and there weren't that many podcasts out there. And it's funny because when I started in 2014, I thought I was late. I thought I was late to the game. I was listening to folks who had started 4 or 5 years early, and I thought they were like eons ahead of me at the time. I felt like 4 or 5 years was like light years ahead. And a couple of things that I've learned along the way, and so much has changed in my business and in my life in 10 years, as it's apt to do with that amount of time. But one of the things I would say here, if you are creating content in any way, shape, or form, YouTube, podcasting, Instagram, any other social media channel, blogging, you name it, that a lot of times, and now what I've seen in 10 years is that the race is not won by the swift. It's won by the steady, those who are steady, those who are consistent. I say this all the time. Consistency is greater than intensity. And I am living proof of that. I've never had a viral podcast episode. I've never had really a viral blog post or a viral Instagram post or social media post in that sense. I've had some do way better than others. I've never hit 1 million downloads on a single episode or a single post or anything like that. If you were to describe me as a baseball player, baseball was my favorite sport growing up. I'm a guy who maybe gets into the Hall of Fame just by playing very consistently over 20 years. I'm not winning an MVP or anything like that in a particular year. I'm just consistent over time. And that's always been my nature. I always feel like, I'll be honest with you, I feel sometimes like I'm behind or I don't push hard enough or whatnot. But one thing I do know is that I will outlast most people. If there are folks who are like lightning in a bottle, I am like that LED lamp you have in your house that just never goes out. You leave it on for days on end and it just never goes out. That's me. And if you're anything like me, I hope that resonates with you. And if you are the lightning in a bottle type of person, consider slowing down and take some time to just enjoy the journey. I think when it comes to what I've seen in my business and how podcasting has been a huge part of that, is that it has documented my journey so much. When I started podcasting 2014, I had a full-time job. I was not in business for myself full-time at that time. And if you go back to those early podcasts, right around episode 35 or so, you can actually hear the episodes where I talk about leaving my job and going full-time into business for myself. I would say to anyone, wherever you are on the journey, but especially for those of you who are younger than me, I'm in my mid 40s now, and you might be working a job and you want to get out, start the path of content creation, start the path of learning these new mediums before you leave, right? So you can leave from a good foundation. It's hard to shoot a cannon from a canoe. Does that make sense? If you got a cannon on a canoe and you shoot it, it's got no base, it's got no foundation. And for me, I had a foundation and there were some starts and stops along the way, right? I thought I was, okay, I've got it figured out. And then I didn't make it. I had to go back and stay at my job and just be patient and be consistent and prove to myself, not that I could do it, but that I could do it consistently. That was a huge part of my success and has been a huge part of my success over the years. I think when I look back on that journey, especially making the leap to go full time, man, it's such a different life. I almost have to struggle to remember what life was like back then. Mid 30s to mid 40s, a big difference in life. A lot can happen. Since that time, I got divorced. I moved a couple times. I traveled all over the world. I ended up working with some incredible clients, well-known clients that if you had told me 10 years ago when I started the show that I'd be working for the likes of these folks and working alongside them, I would have thought that's a little crazy. I don't know how that's going to happen. When I started 10 years ago on this podcast, marketing wasn't even like the main thing that I had on my radar. I did marketing. I knew a lot of marketing, but it wasn't, from a business and a career standpoint, something that I really felt strongly that I would do moving forward. You asked me as a kid, would you turn out to be a marketer? I never would have believed you. So looking back, like the people that I've been able to meet as a result of this podcast and as a result of having a business built around this podcast or building this podcast around my business, vice versa, one feeds the other, one hand holds the other, one hand washes the other, has been nothing short of pretty incredible. Think of Donald Miller and John Maxwell and J.J. Virgin and these people who are recognized as authorities in their field even before I read John Maxwell's books when I was 18 and 19. And then I'm sitting with him in a room. It's just him and I just working on stuff. That's wild to me. Sitting in there, other events that I've been part of backstage and speaking at events and conferences, social media marketing world, my friend Jeff Goins' Tribe Conference, Ray Edwards, so many of these folks that I looked up to when I first started podcasting who have now become friends. They've become people that I just journey with. And that's been an interesting thing where, again, wherever you are in the journey, if you just show up consistently and just get better at your craft, you have your mentors, and some of those mentors just end up becoming friends and colleagues in some way, shape, or form. And you find your footing. I think another thing that I would say is that if I were to go back 10 years and talk to my first 10 episodes podcast self and told him to do what I do now, he would refuse. He wouldn't have the experience or the wherewithal or the wisdom to say yes to this. And I think that so many of us, when we start on this journey, we feel like we have to have everything figured out and what we're going to do for the rest of our lives. And in building a business and building, especially a personal brand business built around your ideas, your expertise, your reputation, your personality, around your personal brand, you have to have a willingness to be able to leave a lot of room for interpretation, a lot of room for things to move in and out of, people to move in and out of your life, ideas to move in and out of your life, products, launches, this podcast. I've named and renamed this podcast probably 3 or 4 times over the last 10 years. I've kept the feed, but I've renamed it 3 or 4 times. It just is a reflection of the not so straight path of doing creative work, of being an entrepreneur, of being a business owner. I differentiate a lot between business owners and entrepreneurs. I think it's one thing to own your own job, own your own craft, your own practice, if you will, and then move into a place where you're truly an entrepreneur and you're building businesses, organizations, teams where other people can do the work that you need them to do for that business to run without you. And I've looked at that journey over the years, and I love doing all of them, right? I love doing all of them. But when I think back on the folks that I've been able to meet, the folks that I've been able to interview, some of my favorite episodes aren't about work. They're not about business. They're just about life. I've had my buddy Henry on this show a number of times. I've had like my friend Christopher Hopper, who he and I go back like 15, 20 years. Nate Kronk's been on here. These guys are lifers to me, lifelong friends, and they don't do what I do for a living, but to have them on here and for them to be like, dude, I'm on Mike's podcast. This is awesome. We're just going to have a couple of glasses of wine and just kick back and just talk. And it's so cool to think that like their kids maybe one day will tune into those episodes and be like, oh, that's my dad or my mom with Uncle Mike. That's pretty wild. Maybe my nephews one day will tune into this podcast and listen to a couple of these episodes. I had my oldest nephew, Haru, one time do the intro to a podcast, and that was super cool, right? So cute at the time. Now his voice is getting a little deeper and all that. And this podcast has just been a consistent presence in my life. And if you've been with me on this journey for any amount of time, thank you. You've been a part of that journey. I started out in New Jersey, in River Edge, launching this podcast in Piscataway, New Jersey, where I lived at the time. I had a condo, and I remember those early years. My ex-wife, she didn't really understand what the heck I was doing. She's like, a podcast? What are you talking about? Okay, just do what you got to do. And I got to give her credit. She was supportive in those things, not supportive in the fact like she would be like, yeah, I'll listen to your podcast and tell me what you're going to talk about. Not that, but it was more like supportive by omission. I'm just going to leave you alone. I'm not going to give you a hard time. You go do what you need to do. And I'd buy this recording gear, and it was way overpriced, the stuff I bought at the time. Now you can get these, like this mic I'm holding costs $100, $120, right? So it's like the technology now has just made things so easy to do. But I remember just pouring over my laptop and these audio files, and I had a music background, so I understood a few of the things that you need to do audio-wise, but editing a solo episode until 4 a.m. just to remove all of the ums, then getting upset at myself for saying so many ums, and feeling like this podcasting thing is going to be fine. It's going to be easy. I do come from a music background. I've done a lot of public speaking because my time at church and all that stuff. It was so weird speaking to an audience that wasn't there. Like speaking to this microphone or looking at this laptop now and this like, into this camera because I'm doing stuff on YouTube. It's so uncomfortable. Still, it's uncomfortable. I feel a lot of resistance before I turn on this camera. I'm used to podcasting without having to worry about the camera and all that stuff. But nowadays, I'm trying to do YouTube. I'm trying to move forward. I'm trying to push myself creatively. And it's harder because I'm older and I'm more set in my ways, but I still adopt the mindset of a novice, of a rookie. And it harkens back to what I shared earlier, that here's one thing I do know after 10 years. I'm going to have young people start out like a house of fire, lightning in a bottle, but I know how to outlast everybody. I know how to outlast myself. I know how to outlast the expectations of what could happen, right? So I've taken this podcast on the road. I've taken a couple microphones with me when I've traveled to Thailand or the Philippines or especially overseas. Those were some of my favorite memories, and I really video those. I didn't document them, and if I did, I lost all the photos and videos because this is before all the iCloud backups. I use an iPhone, and I didn't have Google Photos or anything like that to back things up. And I remember literally the first night of my first business conference ever that I hosted here in New Jersey in 2017, my phone broke and I lost all of that content. So there's like this whole this chunk of missing years from the photos and videos. I have no photos of me starting this podcast. Like I don't have any of it. And I'm like, man, that stinks, but I have the audio because I published it and it's out here on the internet. I've gone through so many ups and downs, professionally speaking, personally speaking, but I'm still here in this podcast, and you as a listener, for no matter how long or short you've been a part of the journey, has been a part of that. And I really appreciate that. It means a lot to me. And I think after 10 years, I've realized how important this podcast is to me. It's the most consistent thing that I've ever done. I haven't blogged consistently over the last 10 years. I haven't posted on social media consistently over the last 10 years. I'm not really a social media person. And for me, it was an issue of just learning to run my own race. I said that a couple of episodes earlier in the year, just learning to run your own race. And some of these people that I've worked for have shaped that, worked with, been hired by, been contracted by, have shaped that. I have often asked myself as I work with some of these really well-known people behind the scenes, and I see what it takes to live their life and to run their business the way that they do and their life schedule. And I just said to myself, I don't want that. I don't want to. Great, $30 million company doing online coaching and consulting. What amazing! And you got 30 full-time employees. You got people. I just didn't really ever want to do that. Right? I like to keep things lean and simple, and so I stopped comparing myself to the people that I was hired by or worked with or contracted by. I learned what I needed to learn, but as a result of seeing their lives, I just knew that wasn't really what I wanted. I think another thing for me, having this podcast that has allowed me to do is that when I had learnings from those experiences being contracted and working alongside some of these folks, I had an outlet to share those ideas very quickly. For me, while I enjoy writing here and there, and people say I'm a good writer, it's much easier to talk it out, for me at least. And so this podcast and having it there to be able to go to a John Maxwell event and speak a little bit on stage and talk a little bit about the things that I'd done with him, and then be able to come on this podcast and share those experiences and those learnings solidified that in me. The age-old saying is that if you want to really learn something, teach it. And having this podcast allowed me to do that. Let me talk a little bit about numbers. I've never really been a get caught up in numbers type of person. There are other friends of mine who have incredible podcasts, colleagues, friends, incredible podcasts, talk about numbers in their business, how much they're making. That's a big part of what they do in their business. I've just never really done that. Folks that I listened to when I was starting out 10 years ago, before I went full-time, guys like Pat Flynn, John Lee Dumas, are guys it's like they're just guys, we've hung out a bunch, and some are closer than others, but it's just an interesting dynamic to feel like the people that you listen to and tune in, me myself included, and I'm not the world's best at anything and all that, but to realize these are folks who are just like me. They just started out and they just started publishing and started creating, and look how their lives transformed, and their growth was documented along the lines of their podcast. It's pretty incredible. Looking now back at it, over 1 million downloads, 400 plus some odd episodes on this podcast. I've taken a couple of months off here and there. I remember after my divorce, I took about 6 months off. I just didn't have the creative energy to keep showing up. This podcast taught me how to create systems. I realized that not showing up for 6 months, it had something to do with my creative energy at the time, but it also had a lot to do with my systems, or the lack thereof. My friend Chelsea Brinkley, who I've worked with almost since the beginning of my business going full time, set up those systems and allowed me to publish. Danny Osmond, who came in, completely changed the nature of my podcast and the production value and how I podcasted through his agency, Emerald City Productions, to come alongside him or him to come alongside me rather, and just take all this audio editing, all those duties off of my plate. To have him as a friend and an ally in this journey has been incredible. I met Danny at Podcast Movement, which was the first business conference I ever spoke at, Podcast Movement. And I got to give big thanks to my buddy Jared Easley. Jared and I have known each other since the beginning of my journey. We don't stay in touch too often anymore. It's like he's done his thing, I've done mine. It's always been cordial. He's always opened doors for me. I've always appreciated him. And how funny. He had me speak at the first Podcast Movement. Now, I wasn't speaking at doing a session. I was on a panel, right? I was facilitating a panel. And my podcast was only a few months old at the time. And so here I am hosting a panel at Podcast Movement when my podcast is only a couple months old, and there's a ton of other people who had much longer running podcasts, and he just opened doors for me. And I always look back on that. You always remember your firsts, right? You remember firsts easily. It's just human nature. And he opened those doors for me. And it's because I had a podcast, right? At least I had a podcast, and that opened the door to be on stage or in front of a few people at Podcast Movement. I ended up doing sessions there 2 or 3 more times. And that was such a huge validation for me, especially starting out, coming from such a drastic career change and career pivot from a music director role at a church into marketing and my own consultancy and now creating content. And that's why till this day, when I host these events of mine, like I run mastermind groups, I have a membership community called You Are the Brand. When we do these events, I really try to platform other people, give them time to present, give them a chance to speak. It was so meaningful to me. It changed the game for me. Jared changed the game for me. So I look back at that and I'm eternally grateful. One of the podcasts I listened to just without fail, or several of them without fail when I started out, because I was so new to the online marketing world. I understood marketing, but I didn't understand this whole personal brands thing and building your own personal platform. Michael Hyatt was huge. I listened. He was, as far as I can recollect, he was the first person I found online when I was blogging, and I just needed a creative outlet because I wasn't doing music anymore. And Mike must have had really good SEO, because I think I Googled something like how to blog, and his stuff came up, and I started listening to his podcast. I didn't read all his blog posts. I started listening to his podcast. He had a lot of episodes already published. So I would drive an hour to work here in New Jersey and drive back home. And I stopped listening to what my ex-wife at the time called gossip for men, sports radio, right? And now, listen, if you live in New York, New Jersey, it's hard. If you're a sports guy, it's hard to not listen, especially to sports radio back in those years, because they had Mike and the Mad Dog, one of the greatest sports talk radio shows of all time. They were the pioneers. So I listened to those guys going up to work, and an hour every day, and it was great radio. But at some point, I decided to stop listening to gossip for sports guys and start listening to podcasts. And Michael Hyatt was in my car every weekday, for hours on end. And coming back home, I'd listen to his podcast, or I listened to Ray Edwards' podcast. And when I crunched the numbers and I did a little bit of math, I realized, like, when I went to one of Ray's early events out in San Diego, he was my age now, and 10 years ago. And I remember how much that meant to be able to be at his event. And he had an opening just randomly at the event. Very last minute, he asked me to speak. And I filled in, I jumped in, I was ready. And I just remember those early years were like a lot of fun, a lot of unknowns, really a lot of unknowns. But because of this podcast and other people's podcasts, I was able to navigate those seasons in life. I made the leap in late 2015, like September of 2015, to go full-time in my business. I've never looked back. I've had great years every single year, revenue-wise, financially. I didn't always have my schedule worked out. I worked like crazy during those years. But then right then and thereafter, my personal life just got thrown for a loop. Just 6 months after I went full-time in business, September 2015, I went full-time in my business. And February 2016, just about 6 months later, I'd been married at the time for about 10 years. And you talk about having a lot of things in your life thrown upside down. You're 6 months into what you're doing. You're loving your work. You've reached the dream, right, to work for yourself. But I remembered that just being such, whoa, just like, you talk about life sideswiping you. And I remember like feeling such an obligation to my audience, not an obligation in a bad way, but like I felt like I need to say something, because I didn't want them to think that like I wasn't publishing consistently. And that responsibility to show up consistently for an audience helped me, even when I didn't want to do the podcast. It helped me get out of my own head and stop spinning and just say, this is one concrete thing that I can do to have some semblance of normalcy in my life again. Or this is because I started the podcast. I'd been podcasting for 2 years at that point. So this had become by then a habit. It become something normal. And when the rest of my world shook, this podcast was there. You were there if you were listening at the time. And so I look back at that time of my life now, hopefully as an older and wiser man now, in midlife, and I just look back and I can't hug my podcast. It's it's an intangible thing, but man, I'm glad I had this show. I'm glad that I had this show. And I'll be honest, if I really assess my podcast, there's one thing you should know about me. I tend to grade really low when it comes to myself. I grade low. I lowball a lot of things. I'll admit that. I lowball my prices. I lowball my fees. I lowball the impact I might have on people. If a friend told me, or I had a client or someone in my mastermind who had podcasted for 10 years, 400 plus episodes, I'd be like, that is a really significant accomplishment. And yet when I say that to myself, I'm no big deal. And I tend to lowball. But just being able to look back now on this body of work and know that I showed up for others and in some degree for myself for 10 years has helped me change the narrative of how I think. A lot of what I've created over these years doesn't feel like I created anything. If I gave my podcast a grade, I'd probably give it a B. And you might be like, no. And then others might be like, yeah, it's not even a B. And you know what? It just doesn't matter. It's just what it is for me. And now that I've hit this milestone, like I really appreciate it. And again, I didn't hit a home run every episode. I didn't. Neither did I take the podcasting thing too seriously. And I think, again, a few minutes ago when I said I never thought of myself as a podcaster, it's because I didn't want it to define my identity. I just wanted it to be something I happened to do. And I know other podcasters who consider themselves a podcaster and they really take the craft seriously, and I'm all for that. But I have a different craft as a marketer, as a messaging strategist. That's my craft. As an author, that's my craft. So podcasting has always been the thing I do. It hasn't been my main craft. But for those who it is their craft, I so appreciate it and I so commend you. I think of folks like Jeff Brown, who has the Read to Lead podcast. I remember listening to Jeff when I was still driving up to work, and he was one of those podcasts that I would tune into right alongside Michael Hyatt, right alongside Ray Edwards. It would be Jeff Brown, and I'd tune into his show and I was like, gosh, this guy's so good. This guy's so good at what he does. This is an incredible show. He's incredible. And to have him speak at my mastermind, my conferences all these years later, like super cool, right? I think about those shows as A shows, like Pat Flynn, like all the people I listened to at that time. I was like, gosh, these are A podcasters. I'm just like a B. I'm just mailing it in. And yet I look now and I look back on it, and it's not the individual episodes. It's the sum of the parts. Like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, if that makes sense. So it's just interesting. I like a lot of emotions get stirred up as I think about those years and how I started out. And it's why I care about people who are in that phase of business and life. As I've now reflected back on this journey, yeah, I've consulted for some pretty big companies and organizations through these last 10 years. I got to tell you, I still love small business and solopreneurs. I've always rooted for the underdog. And to me, small business owners and solopreneurs have so much more on the line if things go wrong. And marketing is one of those industries where people take advantage of others so much. And I just want to be a force for good. I'm not always hitting home runs when it comes to serving my clients and stuff like that. I do the best I can, and no one's perfect, but I do know that I've always put in as much effort for them as if it were my own business. That's how important it is. And so I'm glad when I look back now that I've stayed in this lane and I've stayed here. Do I have any regrets about this podcast or things that have happened in my business over the last 10 years? I think there's a part of me, I don't know that it's a regret. I do wish I pushed a little harder on promoting the show. Maybe that would have done some more good and helped reach more people. It's odd. I'm a marketer, but I've always struggled with self-promotion. I've just always been that way. I didn't want like a lot of the limelight on me or anything like that. I just felt like if I put good stuff out, others will share it. Word will get out. The right people will find me. at the right time. That's the attitude that I've always had. I haven't promoted my podcast heavily over the years. If I did that, would I have double the amount of listeners, double the business? And I don't know. I don't know. But I can't say it's a regret. I can't say I regret not pushing harder. I do wish that I swung for the fences a little bit more in trying to secure guests and maybe some quote unquote bigger names. But that wasn't as meaningful to me as opening this podcast up to interviewing others who may never have done a podcast interview before. Most people don't know this. Most of the guests I've had on this show over the last 10 years were folks from within my coaching community or mastermind community who have a lot of expertise and people just don't know who they are. And again, it goes back to opening a platform, opening a stage, albeit a virtual one on this podcast, for others to share their expertise. Because when you do and you edify somebody like that, like you give them an incredible gift of seeing themselves and validation and affirmation. And that can do so much for people who day in and day out are pretty on their own when they're growing a business. When I think about my personal life and what's happened and transpired in 10 years, my business has shifted. I've shifted. I've become way more grounded now. There have been some significant business milestones along the way. I've generated millions of dollars in revenue in that business, and I've written a best-selling book, it's now being translated into multiple languages, and started a YouTube channel in my 40s. And like, gosh, am I too late and all that stuff? But I think about all the other personal stuff, right? I got my scuba diving certification. I developed a gratitude practice. I got into Muay Thai and kickboxing. I moved to the beach for a little while. I traveled a lot. It's these things where I can't imagine experiencing those things and not having an outlet to share and add value to people. And the podcast has made that so easy to do. Years ago, I went to a Tony Robbins event, and he talks about the 6 human needs. And a target, a dartboard, a bullseye. And on the outer ring, you want certainty. And then next one in, you want variety. And it's interesting how those two concepts are opposed to each other, right? You want certainty, but you also want variety. You want new things. And next you have significance, and then you have love. And he says the 2 that are on the inside, the 2 innermost rings, next one's growth, and the center is contribution. And I remember going to his event and feeling like, gosh, what are your top 2? That's what people need to figure out. And if you know what your top 2 are, it can tell you a lot about how your life might unfold, if that makes sense, right? If your primary driver is significance and certainty, like you're going to try to control everybody. You want to be important and you need certainty, so you're going to control everybody. That makes sense, right? Now, no slam on those who have those as their ideals, but I get his point. And I remember going to that event and I'm like, gosh, I think it's love and I think it's growth. And I remember working through the exercises and they're like, what about contribution? I was like, I don't know. I don't really think about it because I think I have a podcast. And I can contribute to people through this podcast. So I don't really think about contribution a lot. I just know that I have an outlet to share my experiences, share lessons, allow other people to share what they've learned. That's because of this show. It's because of this podcast that's been renamed 3 or 4 times. And yet here we still are. It's very hard for me to imagine my life without the podcast because of how much it's done for me, not just from a business standpoint, just from a personal standpoint, how it's aligned with my values to grow myself and to contribute by sharing those lessons and to show love to people who have chosen to be in my world and allowed me to be in theirs. If people join my mastermind, join a coaching community that I run, join my You Are the Brand Academy, they've chosen to allow me to be in their lives to some degree and to be able to give those folks an opportunity to contribute to the world, to my audience, to you, to others who listen to this. What a gift, right? What a blessing that is. 10 years, I know not how much longer I'll go, but I don't see any reason to stop. I still will miss a few episodes here and there. I'm human. While I have the system, sometimes I get sick or tired or I don't plan out enough. And I'll be honest, there are a lot of days where I just feel like I'm not publishing good content. but I just keep doing it. I just keep showing up and try to make it meaningful. And if anything, I listen to those early episodes, I cringe. I'm like, oh my gosh, dude, calm down. I sound so young and so like energetic. My buddy Robbie Fowler, we were listening to a teaching that I did for our year at the Brand Academy, but I recorded it years ago, but the content was still evergreen. So I thought the lesson was good. He was laughing. He's, my gosh, that was Mike before he had a lot of whiskey. Your voice has definitely changed over these last couple of years. And we were just having a good laugh about that. And for me, that's what this kind of business and this life is about. It is doing things I love with people that I really love in meaningful ways. And I'll button this all up by saying this, like, my work week is full of really beautiful moments, beautiful hours, beautiful days. And it just hit me recently. That is not common. I run some coaching groups. I talk about stuff on podcasts. I interview people. And sometimes I'm just moved to tears, like the stories that are told and the things that people share. And who can say that about their work week? That it's full of beautiful moments, beautiful people, beautiful stories, entire hours where people are just saying beautiful things about one another and lifting each other up. That's one of the things that we do in my masterminds. And I just sit back and I'm just like, gosh, I'm like the luckiest person in the world. I'm like the luckiest person in the world. And on a very practical level, having this podcast has enabled and empowered a lot of that. So if you're thinking about starting one, if you've started and stopped and given up, tap into some of the deeper reasons. I hope something I shared along the way here today resonated with you and maybe give you cause to think a little bit more about it. And maybe it's not a podcast for you. Maybe it's something else, but love it. Love the medium. Love what you can do for people because of the medium. And if you do that, I think it'll come back around. I truly believe that it'll come back around and you will tap into an abundance that you may not know was accessible. So here we are 10 years later, February 2024. I started in February of 2014. Unbelievable. Thank you if you've been part of the journey for any amount of time. Thanks for, even if today's your first episode, thanks for tuning in. I'll try to make this show worth your time. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. See you on the next episode.